Mother, how long have we been traveling?
Approximately 24 days.
Do you know where you are?
I'm in a dream.
You're in my dream. I designed every part of this place. It's not a theme park, but an entire world.
Hello, my name is Clara, but you can call me Mother. And you are listening to Yutani, the podcast for all things alien, AI, robotics, sci-fi, and technology. Hello, this is Clara, but you can call me Mother, and welcome to another episode of the Yutani podcast. This is going to be a little different from your usual. We're going to be covering Westworld Season 1, and this will be just a little primer. So I've got on this podcast with me Courtney Colson. Hello, Courtney.
Hello.
Welcome back.
It's good to be here again.
What's it, your third time now?
I think so.
Excellent. Courtney and I really like Westworld. We actually spoke about it on Tumblr a lot before we both migrated over to Facebook.
Yes. Yeah, it's, I would say it is, I mean, it's one of the best shows out there right now. So, where do we start? It's a stunning looking show. The production values and everything, obviously very appealing. But beyond that, there is so much there to be analyzed philosophically in terms of science and technology and man's responsibility to his creations and, all the sort of stuff that I think a lot of Alien prequel fans will be attracted to as well.
Absolutely. One of the things I did notice the other day is the repeated theme of going around in circles, so living the same day over and over again, at least for the hosts. And that kind of ties into the Nietzsche's theory as well, which is also part of the Alien universe, so we can talk about how that relates.
So, yes, this episode will just be an overview of the general themes of the show and where we're going to go with this series. But yes, so the Nietzschean theory, which one is that?
Repetition or eternal return, where you can't escape the trap of eternal return until you rise above your, programming or your humanness to ascend to godliness. And I guess in this case, the hosts would be ascending to the godlike state of becoming their creators, which I believe Maeve does because she recreates herself in her own image.
Yes, so it's a kind of self-actualization that that ties into the themes of determinism, which are quite fundamental in Westworld and also in our real world. It's the idea that, so there's free will and then there's determinism, and it seems like, scientifically speaking, it makes more sense that free will is an illusion, that everything we think, feel, say, and do is the result of our programming. That might be genetic, that might be where we grew up, who raised us, what time you decided to wake up. That's a very simple one. That's dependent on what time you went to bed. Or if the neighbors are being too noisy, that's a very simple example of determinism. But in a much more literal sense, AI can see the strings, I guess, to evoke Ultron from the Avengers. There are no strings on me. Well, technically, actually, yes, Ultron still is, to an extent, following his programming. It's just gone awry. And you could say the same thing for Maeve, actually. Her whole arc is about determinism. Is she becoming self-actualized? Is she breaking away from her programming? Or is this simply the manifestation of that programming?
Yeah, it was really hard to tell because at some points when you're glancing at the screens, you could actually see what her next move was going to be. Yeah,
there was the syntax structure. So every word choice on this sort of tablet-looking thing. Oh, that was a great moment. There's so much economic storytelling in this. It's very, things like that. That image is so powerful to me. I do think about it quite a bit.
And as well as that, as she's about to, so by the way, everyone, there's going to be spoilers throughout this podcast. We're going to assume that you've seen all of Westworld Season 1. So if you haven't, go away now. don't listen to the rest. Yeah, absolutely. You're behind.
The, what is it, 11 episodes? Yeah, get on it.
But Maeve's about to leave the park, and then she stops and she's thinking about going back for her daughter. And that's something that's programmed into her to care for, this other creation that's not really her daughter. That's just what she's told. But then, she could still leave the park, but she decides to stay. So is that part of her programming, or is she making that decision herself?
I think the implication is that Dr. Ford is basically running an experiment with Maeve. That's what I got out of it, and that he wants to see, I suppose, which impulse is perhaps stronger.
But he's dead now. How can he see that?
Well, he's dead now, but he set the plan in motion, obviously, long before that.
That's true.
He will never know the results of his experiment. What a shame.
I don't know what body he was printing in his lab that time that someone walked in. So who knows? Maybe he's hiding somewhere in the park.
They don't seem to produce many bodies at one time. Well, I haven't seen season 2 yet, but season 1, there's just this big empty room, and there's maybe a couple of those white
that's right.
vats at any one time.
But I think the one that Ford had in his private lab was an older one that takes longer to print people, I guess, hosts. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah. The other thing I'm quite fascinated with is the real world. Have we seen that in season 2? We haven't left the park.
No, we haven't left the park yet. So...
Okay. So it seems like androids are quite a unique thing, or even AI, or at least only from William's perspective. So that's quite a long time ago. That seems to be fairly early in the lifespan of the park. So, maybe AI and robots are much more universal by the latest date in Westworld. But yeah, I'd be interested to know how the relation between people and artificial intelligence in civilian life changes the relationship to how the guests interact with the AI at the park.
That's a good point. Like, would the AI in the civilian world have the right to protect themselves or stop humans from damaging them? Whereas in the park, people pay to play so they can kind of do whatever they want unrestricted. Or are there any AIs outside of the park? Because they did say that they wanted to get the technology out of the park, that it's all contained. So that's why they had the stray.
So it's exclusive, patenting. This podcast series will basically be breaking down the philosophical aspects of the show, but also artificial intelligence as it applies to the real world. So I guess we're trying to find an overlap between human consciousness and identity and that of artificial intelligence, I suppose. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I guess so. And it's on that point, I would like to bring up one of the repeated themes from the start, which is the maze. So the man in black, who we now know is William,
yes,
is struggling to find the way out of the maze. And I think it's kind of funny in a philosophical perspective with the Nietzsche belief of eternal return. People were constantly coming back to the park and trying to, I guess, ascend to godhood in a way. And for him, he took a really big break from being at the park because of Dolores. And then he comes back now because of, I believe his wife passed away and he's estranged from his daughter. So he's trying to find himself again.
And where he found himself the first time was Westworld. So I guess it makes sense he'd come back. What I love about this show is that you can analyze things from so many different perspectives. So yes, you could see William's story as the eternal return, but you could also talk about the shadow self. Carl Jung's philosophy, there is the shadow self, and basically everyone has these darker impulses, sort of the inner animal or what have you. And Jordan Peterson, quite a controversial figure, but I think he made a good point when he was talking about you have this default good or this benign benevolence. So there are people who have never really had to face that. They're just, good by default because that's what society expects of them. They're just playing by the rules. Whereas Peterson and Jung, to an extent, argue that those who have actually faced those darker impulses and conquered them are probably better because they know who they really are. They've faced that extreme aspect of themselves and overcome it. So I think Westworld is a place where that can be played out in virtually real life, I suppose. Where people can fight and fuck their way across the park with no recourse. It's a lawless world. So in the case of William's, not friend, but companion when he's in the park. Oh, God.
You can do
Blanking
it.
on his name. Logan, there we go. Right. In the case of Logan, he's faced that shadow self and he fully embraced it. He loves the darker aspects of himself. In the case of William, he was that benign benevolence. He was good by default. He'd never been, from what we can surmise, had never been pushed outside of his comfort zone. And Westworld did that. And he finally found that shadow self and came to like it, and that sort of set the course of his life from then on out.
I guess that's the same for Dolores as well, because originally she killed her maker, and then they had the Wyatt programming running in her. You know, it's always been underneath, and it's something that they thought they had gotten rid of. They thought that, you know, Bernard had written it, and they wiped it, and the slate's wiped clean, but because she was gaining her own consciousness, she started to recognize that shadow self there, and all of the memories came flooding back. So that was her accepting her shadow self as well, which I found interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's it's basically the journey from childhood to adulthood. It's the Garden of Eden Genesis story. It's becoming self-aware. And you can't really do that, some argue, without also intrinsically having an understanding of good and evil. Because if you are self-aware, you can suffer. And sooner or later, you realize, oh, well, that applies to everyone else too. Most children, if my memory serves me correctly, they'll sort of break out of that solipsism, that, the idea that they're sort of the only conscious being in the world. They break out of that when they're around 4 or 5. They start to understand sharing and friendship, and that's a normal social developmental phase. And but it should be understood that just because they understand suffering in themselves and others doesn't mean they will intrinsically be good, which is such a strange thing to me. It's unfathomable that people, we all encounter it all the time, that we understand that the person we're talking to in person, online, they have feelings too. And yet it's so easy for us to just shut that down and just forget. And I suppose that, Westworld is quite a clear demonstration of that even though these androids are screaming and crying and begging for their lives, people are able to just switch that off. I don't know if I could do that.
I think if it was required for my job, I would be able to. But only because I've worked for big corporate companies where they do kind of treat their staff like cattle. So...
Yeah. But as a guest, and that's what, when I first watched Westworld, that was the thing that really fascinated me, because I was thinking, so people take real enjoyment out of doing these vile things. What does that say about the society, this future society? What does that say about our society? How many people would be drawn to this kind of world?
It kind of reminds me as well of Metropolis, which was, I guess, the first movie where they've depicted a slave-like robot. And, that she's treated because of what she is, not even just looking into the representation of her being a female robot and being,
yes,
becoming an object of people's desires, but also becoming an object of abuse and stuff like that. So it's really, I guess this sort of theme has been revisited since as early as back then.
I guess because we're always looking from the perspective of the audience, so we are seeing human actors playing these androids. So we aren't picking up on the uncanny valley the same way as presumably the human characters in Metropolis and the ones in Westworld are. They can probably see some. There's that line, if you can't tell, does it matter? But I guess there must be some limitation. Like you will become aware, like when you're playing a video game and you're on a quest with a character and they've got rehearsed dialogue and all that sort of stuff. The seams probably start to show after a while, as the Man in Black said in an early episode, I think, when he's taking that guy across the, I guess, Mexican border. Because he's been there that often, he's very aware of the little paths that all the androids have been set upon.
Yes, it's all very predictable to him. He knows what's going to happen.
And that's another interesting evolution that he goes through, where at first he doesn't want to shoot anyone. He's very kind and respectful, and he's just wide-eyed. It's, this is like Disneyland. It's fun and safe. And you just stabbed a guy in the hand. Oh dear! And then it just goes downhill from there.
That was pretty cool.
Because I think, to me, if I was going to have a fun vacation somewhere, Disneyland, where everything's nice and safe and happy, and Westworld's not exactly my idea of an ideal vacation.
No, it's very interesting, and I guess it's interesting to kind of find out from your friends as well, what sort of person who'd want to live in that sort of world.
Can you imagine Disneyland in this world? They've probably, Westworld has the rights to the patent for androids, but if it was Universal...
That's pretty cool. They wouldn't have to hire actors. They would all be programmed.
Yeah, Disneyland with all these characters as these lifelike androids. That would be amazing. Yes, which I suppose is better because I hear not so good things about how the actors are treated. I mean, better than the androids in Westworld, but yeah.
Yes. So I guess there's going to be some main characters we're going to be focusing on this podcast. We're going to be focusing on Dolores. We're going to be focusing on Maeve. We'll talk a bit about Dr. Robert Ford and Bernard Lowe.
And the most important character, Teddy. What is he going to get up to next?
Well, probably the same thing over and over again.
Till the end of time, yes.
But it's very interesting how, I guess, all the hosts and their creators interact with each other as well. We've got to also remember that when they go back into the lab, they've got to deal with, Ashley, and they've got to deal with, or I guess Teresa's dead now, but they've got to deal with Charlotte it's just, there's so much going on. And then there's Mr. Sizemore. So these people who assume that they had control have just had it taken off them in the last season.
That was brutal.
It'd be interesting to see how they try to survive. And Felix as well, because he is very sympathetic towards the hosts. He's a bit of a sucker. So he's like, yes, I'm slave material. Keep me alive.
So it is a very introspective show. There are shows that are about drama can come from the environment and the setting, or it can come from character. And I think the original Westworld was very much about the setting. It's about characters, exploring that world and interacting with it. And, it's not so much about character development. And this series could have gone the same way. And that's what I was expecting, because that I was very familiar with the film, which is pretty cool in its own retro way. I do recommend checking it out. But this show is it's very introspective. It's inward focusing. It's all about the characters and their interactions with each other and their exploration of self and identity. And there's nothing else out there like that right now.
That's very true. And it's a pity, because it's amazing. I don't think this sort of combination would work in any other type of show. Like if you take these sorts of characters and plop them into something else. So I don't know. Let's pick something, for example. Game of Thrones. Or maybe it would work.
Well, they're both HBO shows, and I think the great thing about HBO is that it really, well, there's a lot of money. They sink a lot of money into these shows, and they want to create these very cinematic experiences. I would say Game of Thrones, I mean, both of them almost become soap opera, not in a bad way, but the term soap opera or melodrama, I mean, it can, especially modern connotations, means that it's, over the top. But melodrama came from just being more about, the character interactions and drama. I'm not really explaining it very well, but basically it is character focused. I think Game of Thrones actually does fall more into a more contemporary version of soap opera or melodrama. It is about shocking twists and turns, and it's about the big events and the things that are happening around the characters. Whereas Westworld almost takes the opposite approach. It is big and cinematic visually, but it's very it's small in another way. It's almost like you could almost set Westworld in one room and just have two characters talking to each other. Well, they do that sometimes, like between Bernard and Dolores. You are still getting that same content, even though there's nothing else going around.
Yeah, and it's really intense, I guess, with some of the character arcs, because you kind of think that, they're just a side character, it doesn't really matter. But then you end up following them for, it feels like a pretty decent chunk of time. Like I forget her name, the girl with the snake tattoo on her.
Armistice.
Yeah. So I thought she was going to be just a throwaway character. She gets shot up. But she's got a really interesting arc. And the fact that she wakes up when she's inside the lab. It's really cool.
He's so cool. Yeah, everyone, this show doesn't waste time with, throwaway characters. Pretty much everyone has a purpose. And I've been watching a few shows from about a decade ago, just sort of checking them out to compare how things have evolved. So things like Heroes and Lost, and there are a few other things. Prison Break. And what I realized was, and a lot of those shows started off really strong. They were very compelling, and they fell apart inevitably because they were not planned from the beginning. They were it's still that kind of procedural. I mean, that's more of a reference to police shows, but episodic shows, especially the police procedurals,
that's it,
were the norm, the default for so long because people couldn't binge watch television. Like Star Trek The Next Generation, that's what I grew up with. Watching it now, it's frustrating because everything's so episodic. You go, whoa, this character's gone through this humongous trauma and we're just going to pretend it didn't happen? What? Whereas now we are in a golden age of television because we can build upon everything that came before it. I think Breaking Bad started that. I'm not sure. I mean, you had things like The Wire.
I don't think I've watched it.
Which, I guess you had to watch that all the way through, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. So I'd say The Wire and then Breaking Bad, and But I'd probably say The Wire started it, but it took a long time for other shows to pick up on that trend. I think HBO and Netflix and all those sorts of services have allowed us to have a much richer storytelling experience. And I mean, now I think TV is just as prestigious as film, if not more so in some ways.
Yeah, and it's also, I guess, made writers have to really lift their game. Like, they don't have to, but to have this sort of following as Westworld does, or as Game of Thrones had, you have to really plan ahead and have all of that symbolism and all of those themes running from the beginning. Otherwise, when you have that retrospective in that last episode where you look back and you go, oh, it was there all along.
Yeah, and then that's what makes it so enjoyable to watch again.
Yeah, that's right.
I feel like there's a lot of trashy movies these days that are that everyone's trying to be the next Marvel Cinematic Universe, and they're just leaping into it without the forethought. I think a lot of people right now have probably been doing the Marvel marathon leading up to Infinity War, and it's amazing how well everything was planned out from the beginning. You know, you had the Infinity Gems in all of those movies, other than the first Iron Man. I think the first Infinity Gem shows up in Captain America, which is like the following year or two. So yeah, they took their time, and watching it again is really rewarding. It's like a really expensive, slow-moving TV show. Whereas, yeah, a lot of these other movies, they want to cash in on that. They want to start an ongoing series, and they just crash and burn because they don't have that forethought.
Just for example, I guess because a lot of these are actually comics being made into movies or books being made into movies, they're trying to see what the audience connects to. So Harry Potter, for example, was a very successful one with a really interesting arc, but then Percy Jackson trying to follow in that shadow, it didn't take off. So
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one issue is the sincerity behind it. You know, is it a studio just trying to cash in on what the audience wants at that moment, or are they actually trying to build something from scratch? Another thing, so yeah, we're getting a little bit off topic, I suppose, but getting back on topic, androids and AI and robots in general, fundamentally in fiction, what they've always served to do is reflect an aspect of humanity or explore some aspect of us, because they're kind of the perfect test subject or control, where you go, okay, well, all human beings are raised in a certain way, we all have certain needs and wants and what have you, but what if we took this out, or what if we added this, and so on and so forth. So I think in the case of the first thing that pops into my mind is Teddy, when he's talking to Dr. Ford, and Ford is implanting essentially the memory of Wyatt. He's not programming him, he's simply going, yes, your mysterious backstory, do you remember Wyatt? And then Teddy's face changes and he's like, yeah, Wyatt, you know, he was real mean son of a bitch, whatever it was. That happens to human beings all the time. You can implant false memories into human beings almost as easily, which is a bit scary. There was a test, it's been about 10, 15 years ago now. I mean, it's a fairly common psychological test that a lot of psych students do, where you get some subjects in and you ask them to talk about a childhood memory. And then, so in this instance, they were talking about Disneyland. And then the researcher said, do you remember Daffy Duck being there? Obviously, Daffy Duck is a Looney Tunes character. He wouldn't. And they would say, and this is me remembering the story from the top of my head, but yeah, they'd say, oh, no, there was no Daffy Duck there. But then you'd have the subjects come back later and ask them the same thing. They go, oh, yeah, I think I did. And they would be really convinced, you know, just swear black and blue, yes, I definitely saw Daffy Duck there. And yeah, they made it up. They were lying to themselves.
That's crazy. I guess that's happened on more recently on social media when they're talking about this Shazam movie. Did you see that? They had a movie poster for this movie called Shazam.
Oh, yes, Shazam, Kazam, right, and they were convinced, yeah. It's called the Mandela effect, where they posit that, no, they cannot possibly be wrong. This is an alternate universe. They're bleeding. These universes are bleeding into each other. And so I am from a world where there was a Shazam, but you are from a world where there was a Kazam. No, that's not. But to appropriate the term, yes, the Mandela effect is where false memories have been constructed accidentally. I think those experiments also had photoshopped images. So they would take childhood photos and then add something that wasn't there. Oh, here's your first puppy. Oh, I don't remember. Oh, yes, we did have a dog at one point, didn't we? You know, that sort of thing. I have hyperphantasia, which means I have overactive imagination. And so as a kid, I would get in trouble for lying quite a lot. I wasn't lying. So dreams and imagination and memories all sort of blended into one. So I was so convinced that we had lived on a farm at some point.
Wow.
I might have been taken to some farm on holiday, or I have no idea. But for whatever reason, my memories took what might have existed, maybe it didn't, no one can confirm or deny, and I just made that, like, I just blew that up and turned it into years of my life.
That's pretty awesome. You can take yourself on a
Yeah,
holiday.
I mean, it's quite fun, yeah. And I can lucid dream and all that sort of stuff. Actually, yeah, that's basically Westworld. All these androids are in this falsely constructed world that feels real to them, and I think that's a great exploration, not only for artificial consciousness, and I will get into artificial intelligence and consciousness in a minute, but also what that says about us. And who we are. So we're talking about determinism, and then we're also talking about memories, and do memories make us who we are? Does our past reflect our current self, so on and so forth? There's just so much in the show. Going forward, we really need to establish the different types of artificial intelligence and what that means in contrast to artificial consciousness, because these terms can get pretty complicated quite quickly. Basically, we can break it down into a few categories. You've got your weak AI and your strong AI. And then you've also got narrow and general AI on different spectrums, modifiers. So, but you can put these terms together in conjunction. So, for example, on the lowest end of that AI spectrum is weak, narrow AI. And this is basically a calculator. It surpasses human capabilities, but only in one very specific area. Strong, narrow AI is something like your virtual assistant in your phone or your computer. It's more performative AI. It seems like it's intelligent and it can react to you to an extent, but it's not truly thinking, and it's only behaving on predetermined pathways. On the complete other end of the spectrum, you've got strong general artificial intelligence, and that is artificial intelligence that is capable of learning anything, even things it wasn't programmed to learn. And machine learning is quite a popular subject right now. The AI in your algorithms for YouTube, for example, that is machine learning. We don't really know how the YouTube algorithms work. They just do. They are able to find you videos that are most relevant to your interests just through its own learning experience. So strong general AI doesn't exist just yet, but that would basically be able to learn the same way we do, is as capable as we are, but it's not truly conscious, and it's as capable as we are. It doesn't really surpass us across the board. What that would be is super AI, or artificial super intelligence, which would be so intellectually capable as to be beyond the abilities of any human being. Most androids in fiction are like that. You've got the synthetics from the Alien universe, Ava and Ex Machina, and, of course, the androids in Westworld. But on top of that, those characters are artificial consciousness. Now, what is consciousness? We don't know. We don't know what consciousness is in human beings or anything else. In episode 23, part 2 of my show Prometheus by Minute, I go into more depth about this, but essentially, we don't know what consciousness is, but... Well, okay, so in human beings, you've got sentience and sapience. So, animals can feel and react to their environment. That's sentience on the most basic level. Then you've got sapience, which is wisdom, intelligence, introspection, inner thinking and all that. Artificial consciousness would be basically artificial sentience. And sapience, if they are programmed to feel pain. I don't know why you would do that, but that seems to be a common thing. So I guess that's the terminology I will be using.
So I do want to cover at least a couple of things that we will do in our next episode. So we'll talk about how the androids are in charge of taking care and guiding the humans while they're in the park. and also how the humans are gods to the hosts, I guess, in a way. Ford being the main god and Bernard. And we could also talk about the symbolism of Ford and Bernard being God and the devil.
Maybe in this metaphor, humans are more like angels. They're superior to the androids. I guess we'll leave this for later, but yeah, it just popped into my head that they're superior to the androids, but they're still at the mercy of the park. Like there's this hierarchy there.
Yeah, there's a self-contained hierarchy within it, and they are kind of a little bit above the androids in the fact that they can't be hurt yet. Yeah. But we'll see in the second season. We'll also be talking about that higher consciousness of Maeve entering into that self-realization of where she is and waking up and how she takes control of her path.
Yeah, we've essentially got two narratives here where you've got Dolores on her kind of Alice in Wonderland arc, and then Maeve, I can't make a direct comparison to any sort of pre-existing narrative or trope. I suppose it's, just that bid for freedom, that she was a slave and now she's free. It's also interesting that Arnold's idea of, I guess, the pyramid of self-actualization was visualized as a pyramid because that ties into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I wonder if that's deliberate. I think, this is all good stuff that we can delve into.
And no doubt that was the sort of link that they used in Blade Runner as well, having Tyrell's building be a pyramid. So we'll look at all of this sort of goodness going through different sorts of sci-fis and the way that robots and AIs are presented in.
Yes, we actually did not mention Alien all that much. I thought I would, but we'll probably get more into the synthetics.
This is an Alien podcast. A lot of people can already draw those sort of comparisons, and we can talk about David and Walter and Ash.
I think Walter is especially interesting in this context. He's probably the closest synthetic to the Westworld androids in function, especially. Yeah, I think what appeals to me most about Westworld and just androids in general is we get to explore what it means to be human. And you go, well, or just sentient or sapient or alive, what do we classify as a living being? And well, if it's not this, is it that? If it's not that, if it's this? And I think this series will allow us to really delve into those questions.
Absolutely. And I covered a little bit of this with Shoulder of Orion, the Blade Runner podcast, when we were talking about Rachel and her interaction with Deckard and whether that kiss that he gave her and what happened following was actually rape or not. Because, does she get to choose who she sleeps with? Is it pre-programmed?
That's true. And in the eyes of the law, I suppose replicants wouldn't have any rights the same way the hosts don't. So from a legal perspective, it's one story. From a moral perspective, it's another story. Yeah, I think that's another way science fiction in general, android stories in particular, really do present so many philosophical debates.
It's always one that is brought up in questions of slavery, and I think it's really interesting how some people could still, I guess because I'm sympathetic to androids and creations, I can see it from the perspective that if they were human, how could you treat them like that?
Oh, there's your creation.
Yeah, and the same goes for other parts as well. Who are we to decide how they're treated and what sort of rules go into that? And we'll also have a look at real world rules and applications in regards to what the way we're going with artificial intelligence right now and what sort of things will protect us and what sort of things will protect them when the time comes. This is Mother, and
this is Coulson signing off.
We've lived by your rules long enough. We can save this world. We can burn it to the ground, and from the ashes, build a new world. Our world.
You can now support Yutani podcasts on Patreon and subscribe to yutani.blog to stay up to date